My friend, judge and pastor of New Millennium Baptist Church in Little Rock, Arkansas, Wendell Griffin, writes about a New York Times article which reported on a 2015 Baptist gathering convened by the Reverend Dr. Ronnie Floyd, leader of the Southern Baptist Convention, and Reverend Dr. Jerry Young, president of the National Baptist Convention. The invitation to the select group of pastors offered, quote, a public conversation on racial reconciliation, end quote. Afterwards, the reporter Larry Goldstein asked the question, are there concrete things you see your churches taking on together? What about issues like criminal justice or sentencing reform? Griffin was struck by the answer given by the two leaders. Quote, we are going to encourage our pastors to swap pulpits, get them uncomfortable or at least different environments than they are used to, end quote. Now I quote Judge Pastor Wendell Griffin. Reverend Floyd and Reverend Young plan to swap pulpits. Meanwhile, a black person is slaughtered by a law enforcement agent every 28 hours. Eric Garner was choked to death by police in Staten Island, New York. Michael Brown Jr. was slaughtered by a cop in Ferguson, Missouri. Police later assaulted Brown's neighbors with tear gas when they protested his slaughter. 12-year-old Tamir Rice was slaughtered by police in Cleveland, Ohio. Monroe Isidore, a 107-year-old black man, slaughtered by police while lying in his bed in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Eugene Ellison, a 67-year-old black man, slaughtered by police in his apartment. Walter Scott was gunned down by a cop in North Charleston, South Carolina. Freddie Gray was slaughtered while in police custody in Baltimore, Maryland. Sandra Bland was viciously mauled by a Texas cop and later found dead in her jail cell. Reverend Floyd and Reverend Young plan to swap pulpits. Meanwhile, he goes on, people in Flint, Michigan, a predominantly black city, are suffering from poisoned drinking water. Black students are targeted and diverted from education to incarceration thanks to racially disproportionate disciplinary actions. In the face of these and other countless examples of systemic racial inequality, the two leaders of the two largest Baptist bodies in the United States plan a pulpit swap. This is the challenge for reconciliation. And this is where it needs to be real, radical, and revolutionary. We either stand up in obedience to Christ or we shall be chasing rainbows. Let me come to an end. So how shall we avoid chasing these rainbows? As a very first priority, I should think we must not, under the pressures of disillusionment and anger, abandon the correctness of our decision to forsake revenge, retribution, and punishment, and to pursue authentic reconciliation. In fact, we must publicly, consistently, and prophetically reclaim its foundational righteousness. But we must work hard to make reconciliation that real and radical and revolutionary reality. We must step away from the temptations of political pietism and Christian quietism and the lure of a cheap reconciliation, and we must embrace justice, dignity, and costly discipleship. We must take the restoration of justice and human dignity to its full, public, vivid, and concrete conclusions. We must disavow the illusionary, deliberately created perception that the South African transition was a smooth, consensual, happy process, fair and just simply because we left the wealth and privileges of historically advantaged white South Africans untouched in exchange for the swift creation of a new, privileged elite of black South Africans. We must critically engage the ideas that these arrangements are not the only realistic political necessity, but in fact the key to political and social harmony and a model for other nations and societies to follow. We will have to seriously and thoughtfully question why we are required to believe in sunset clauses and the realities of the balance of power, that they are more expressive of reconciliation than justice, equity, and restitution. We must ask much more critical questions about the secret talks and the hidden negotiations that preceded public negotiations, the so-called end game that dictated the rules for and the content of what became our reconciliation process. Indeed, we must seriously challenge the very notion that the end game was played by a selected few in the dark, privileged exclusivity of pre-negotiations rather than by the people out in the open on the streets of battle and blood and sacrifice and death. To end aggression and war, to seek a better, more just, more humane world in the undoing of justice and the doing of justice, to save the earth from the calamities of our greed and rapaciousness, to restore human dignity as we protect and enhance human rights, to become the embodiment of hope for young and old, to believe that it is not wrong to dream and hope and work for justice, to reclaim the Bible from the distortions of those who wish to use it as justification for injustice, inhumanity, and ideologies of domination and violence. This is the way out of chasing rainbows. Danish pastor and fighter for the resistance against Hitler in those turbulent years and dangerous times of the war was first prohibited by his church to preach and then killed by the Germans, shot like a dog and left in the field for children to discover 2 days later. This Kai Munk was his name, uttered a warning to the church which is as valid today as it was in 1944. When the deck is loaded, when cowardice heaps praises upon that which was before recognized as despicable, then it is the task of the church to realize that the signs of the church have always been the dove, the lamb, the lion, and the fish, but never the chameleon. Thank you for your attention.